Just a little bit of a warning this week, we're going to be talking about paedophile hunters. Now, this is a topic that does elicit a lot of emotion. There's going to be a lot of talk about the legitimacy of these people. However, we just want you to realise that we do not for 1 minute legitimise paedophiles. We do not agree with them, and before anyone gets truly upset with anything that we say, we are talking about this from an academic standpoint and because there are issues that need to be addressed. Thank you.
Hi there, you're listening to Crime Tapes. It's a podcast made in association with Staffordshire University and the School of Law, Policing and Forensics. Each week we take a subject that relates to crime and we discuss it in depth, drawing on the expertise at Staffordshire University. The podcast is hosted by myself, James Treadwell, and my colleague, Kyla Lawton.
The resident Marxist.
And each week we're joined by a guest from the university whose specialism relates to crime, broadly defined. This week we're joined by Charlie Lovett, who's a guest lecturer from the law school, and we're going to be talking about internet vigilantism and in particular the rise of what's termed the paedophile hunter. Now, more broadly, I also think that this relates to the internet and the changing world that social media plays, and we've talked about that previously, and also ties over in some ways perhaps into spheres of things like web sleuthing, which we might come back to in a future podcast. But for now, and in particular, we're going to look at paedophile hunters. But before we do that, we need to think about what paedophile hunters actually are. Throughout history, paedophilia has been a taboo subject amongst the media, but with 21st century journalism and media outlets, there's nowhere to hide anymore. If we go back to just 2004, American channel Dateline NBC launched a reality TV series which it called To Catch a Predator. The entertaining show where a well-dressed, sparkly-toothed TV host, Chris Hansen, worked with the police to lure and eventually arrest individuals who had knowingly arranged to meet underage persons, was quite a success. A series of hidden cameras filmed the individual who'd be confronted and interviewed by Chris and then given the option to leave the house, only for the individual to be pounced on and arrested by the authorities. The series was shut down in 2007 amid controversial entrapment claims. Almost a victory for the offenders, it would seem. But we only have to fast forward a few years and we see that in the world of social media with Facebook, smartphones, faultless streaming capabilities, we have the rise of modern-day internet investigators. In some instances, that's people investigating their own victimisation for small-scale crimes, looking for the bike or the property that they've had stolen, using Facebook to put out appeals for a stolen car, or in some cases...
Usually so Doris can share it in Blackpool for the bike that went missing in Detroit.
Yeah. In some cases it may be successful, but it would certainly seem to illustrate that we now exist in a very online and global world. But so too, that online and global world is now starting to encroach into all types of investigation. If we think about the extent to which people become involved in their own form of web sleuthing, watching documentaries and suggesting what's happened, for example, on the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, or people investigating the reality to the backdrop of the case of Stephen Avery and Making a Murderer, for example, we see that things begin to cross lines, and people without necessarily having investigation experience become involved in investigation.
Like Wagatha Christie.
Wagatha Christie, that's a classic one in some ways. Where we think about, for example, in that case, Colleen Rooney and Rebecca Vardy's spectacular falling out, which we will come back to. Actually, Colleen Rooney proved herself quite a good investigator there in some ways. Now, one aspect of that, it would seem, is the rise of the paedophile hunter, which is basically a sort of budget version of Chris Hansen. The hunters, essentially, normal people, very often regular, everyday Joes, engage on the internet and pose as minors, often then beginning to exchange sordid messages with individuals who are looking to meet children at designated locations. Of course, the whole thing is essentially a sort of honey trap for internet sex offenders, and eventually The person who engages is confronted with a paedophile hunter, very often with a team of individuals armed with a camera, who coaxes out confessions and calls the police. Even though the entrapment element of that type of paedophile hunting has seen some offenders given reduced sentences, or even in some cases them being released into the community if they're charged by the authorities, the naming and shaming and the stigmatising that comes with that form of social media is in effect a sentence that can last for the individual's life. Some will have very little sympathy with that, but others will question whether individuals who have no accountability in some ways to society should be given that sort of power and responsibility and authority. In 2017, David Barker from Wycombe was a prime example of one of those stigmatised by a hunter. David was caught in a sting in Southampton in what's now become the sort of traditional mechanism of paedophile hunting that I've just described. The 43-year-old was arrested on a supermarket car park on suspicion of having arranged to meet a child for the purposes of having sex with them. And the sting, and as a result, his name, his face and personal details about him, including his address, was plastered all over social media. What happened as a result of that is, without police intervention, there was a rift caused between David, his fiancée, and his daughter, and less than 2 weeks after the sting, he and his arrest, he committed suicide by overdose. I mean, this really does bring up the question about the role of legitimacy of paedophile hunters, a group that seem to grow and proliferate at quite an alarming rate in some ways. Increasingly, the authorities, including the police, are sort of seemingly giving over a de facto sort of power to this vigilante group, and certainly those who were arrested as part of paedophile hunter stings are now appearing in courts and in cases receiving custodial sentences on the basis of never having actually committed the contact element of a sexual offence, but having seemed to show a willingness to go through with meeting a child for the purposes of sexual offending. Now, the question therefore becomes, are paedophile hunters essentially doing a public service, or are they raising the concerning threat of vigilante justice? And as we've seen elsewhere in the country, for example, on the Paulsgrove estate and around the naming and shaming of paedophiles by the News of the World newspaper historically, child sex offenders create an emotional backlash in the community that can threaten cohesion, public order, and can escalate to lead to serious acts of violence being perpetrated by those who take the law into their own hands. There's more than just the danger of causing death for the hunters as well. A notable case hitting the news in 2019 was that of 21-year-old Cameron Batterson from Sandyford, who became so desensitised to the material that he was using to entrap would-be offenders that he eventually claimed that he became attracted to the sickening photos that he was downloading in order to catch online predators. The courts heard how Batterson initially accessed websites to snare paedophiles before becoming increasingly attracted to what he saw, and an investigation also revealed that he distributed those pictures to other like-minded sex offenders. The act that he himself had been trying to publicise and claimed that he'd been trying to prevent. So this essentially poses the question on which we're going to focus on this podcast, which is more broadly about the intentions of internet vigilantes, and particularly those who take up the role of paedophile hunters, and how far do they go in order to cross the line themselves? Should we as a society regard that activity as legitimate? Should we endorse it? Should the authorities be fulfilling the role that essentially is being undertaken by private citizens? Or is it simply a public service catching evil perverts that benefits the community. With all that in mind, we're joined today by Charlie Lovett. Charlie's a lecturer in law here at Staffordshire University. Hi, Charlie.
Hello, thank you for having me on.
No problem at all. So, Charlie, your research interest is essentially in paedophile hunters. What sparked that?
Well, I saw an article in our local newspaper, and there was a article that said that there were so many people within Staffordshire and Cheshire who were caught by self-styled paedophile hunters. And I noticed, if you look at crime statistics and statistic reports, there is a significant increase in the number of convictions of sex offenders whose cases involved evidence collected by paedophile hunter groups.
Yeah, so in effect, this is not some abstract discussion in some ways, because we've had expressed concern about the rise of sexual offending in crime statistics for several years now. Now, one of the aspects of that that's had a great deal of attention is the fact that a lot of those convictions may be retrospective. They're historical, they're older, they're looking backwards, they're essentially targeting people who committed their offences, in some cases several decades ago, and are only now being brought to justice. Yeah. But you're suggesting that there may be something different going on as well with another group of essentially crimes within this category, which is the sort of the non-contact offences of sort of possessing indecent material or grooming a child online for the purposes of sexual offending. They're starting to essentially go up, at least in part because people who aren't the authorities are actually actively out there looking for them in a way.
Yeah. So, yeah, as you say, these paedophile hunter groups, what they do is they pose online as an underage child, and they coerce a potential sex offender into meeting who they believe is an underage child for sexual purposes. However, obviously, when they get to this location, when they get to this spot, they're obviously caught by this team of paedophile hunters, and they are outed as a paedophile. Usually it's live streamed on Facebook or on Twitter or whatever, and they do become ostracised from society. However, I mean, there are so many documentaries about this topic on the internet and stuff like that. One of the main reasons against the use of paedophile hunters within the justice system is that many defendants will argue is well, they never actually committed an offence. They were caught before they actually did anything. They try to argue they can't be guilty of being a paedophile because the person they were talking to wasn't in fact a child.
Right, so in essence, they use the fact that there's an element of the entrapment going on as the justification for how they've behaved. I would never have normally done this. It was simply that in this one instance, this group, pressed me so much that I guess that argument is one that some in the public are going to have a little bit of difficulty.
I'm not sure
in
how much weight it holds within a court, but
absolutely.
Certainly, public opinion wouldn't enjoy that one.
Yeah, no, and there's something more general, I think, isn't there, about the role of the paedophile as a particular sort of character of hate in society today. People like David Wilson and John Silverman in a really interesting book, actually, Innocence Betrayed, sort of claimed that the paedophile had become the sort of contemporary folk devil of the day. Now, of course, some people would have concerns about that terminology of folk devil because paedophiles are real,
folk devil implies that it's not a real threat.
Absolutely, and it's certainly true that some of the people who are sweating at home over the safety of their children, perhaps unlike those who
don't sweat,
they're kind of concerned about the very reality that there are people out there who present a risk to their children, and that is perhaps also being exacerbated by
It's social media. It's a rise of social media. At the end of the day, it's almost like you've got a sweet shop full for these people, because I've got a teenage daughter and they spend so much time putting themselves onto the internet, Instagram, Snapchat, pictures of themselves, and they all dress a little bit like they're a little bit older. And I would never turn around and say to my daughter, you can't wear this, you can't wear that, you can't post this, you can't post that, because at the end of the day, you shouldn't be controlling the behaviour of the girl, the child, because of the folk devil, the bad man out there. But kids are a lot more accessible than they ever were before. Years ago, you'd have to go around in a car with some sweets and puppies. Now you just sit there trawling the internet to find kids. And as well, let's face it, the Marxism coming in here now, we do live in a culture where on one hand, the newspaper will berate the man who's looking at the underage girl, and then the next minute we'll put things like only so many weeks until her birthday, and then we can put her boobs in the paper. It's just, we celebrate youth, and women of a certain age are like, well, you're no longer fit to look at anymore. So we're pushing this culture out there at the same time as berating it.
Yeah, it is sort of highly complex, isn't it? Because even in terms of the terminology that we're using. So I mean, we ought to get this clear from the outset that paedophilia, if we're talking about paedophilia, it is a predominant attraction to prepubescent children. Yeah. Now, we don't want to fall into the trap of being accused of not being clear. Now, much of the terminology that's used to describe paedophile hunters is not targeting those who have an attraction to prepubescent children. It's targeting those who have attraction to young teenagers. They're girls who are advertising themselves
15.
as 14, 15, 16. They are below the age of consent. It is a criminal offence to have contact with them for sexual purposes, to try and solicit them into sexual activity or to have sex with them. So we're not suggesting for 1 minute that what the men are doing is in any way, shape or form legitimate. But even the terminology used to describe it is very often not unpacked. And as you say, Kyla, there's an interesting element that this is we exist in what can be a very highly sexualised society, even around youth, for example.
Youth is revered above all else. I mean, there's a reason. If you look at Hollywood films and you see the 50, 60-year-old lead with a 22-year-old wife who's their oldest child is older than the wife. You know, if you look at it on paper of how the ages of the people who are playing these roles, and
within all of that, you can't then be too surprised that there's the sort of rise in some ways of different forms of access, and I thought it was interesting that you said, Kyla, that that traditionally, and certainly I remember it, when we were taught, shout stranger danger in the street, don't go and see the man's puppies. I can still remember, Charlie the cat giving us safety advice. Charlie said, "Don't accept streets. Sweet soft strangers."
This must be a generation
I love the
difference.
Prodigy. The Prodigy was excellent.
That's how Kyla. That's also how we know. If you don't know the Prodigy, you've
never
missed
lived.
Out. But certainly that sort of historic view formed a sort of picture of the child sex offender as a sort of strange man in a rain mac who would hang around at parks and playgrounds and would be at risk of abducting children. And that's long been the object of concern. But certainly one of the things that's been shown, it's true, isn't it, Charlie, that those who are being targeted and who are coming to light in these paedophile hunter stings are not necessarily old single men. There's a much greater group of society being pulled in. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it's like you mentioned Cameron Batterson. He's only 21 years old and he is being labelled as a paedophile, albeit correctly. Yes, he did have sexual relations with an underage child. But there are,
How old was the underage child?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you.
Were they over a teenage or?
I believe he was probably around 14 or 15. I think this brings me on to my point, is that what we're seeing is a sort of a new generation of paedophiles, because it's no longer, 40, 50.
Is it a new generation of labelling, though? Because I remember, I'm going to get this out there, when I was 14, 15, I would have boyfriends with 17, 18, 19 back in the 90s, and nobody batted an eyelid.
That's my point.
I would get picked up from school on the back of motorbikes, in cars. These lads would have dinner with my family on a Sunday, and my mum and dad would love them and say, oh, he's such a lovely lad. Whereas now, they would be branded a paedophile.
Yeah, and that's my point. Is that these people will still be labelled paedophiles. Although you've got to admit, I think in the public opinion there is a difference, a significant sort of, I suppose, more acceptable between a 40 or a 50-year-old man having sexual relations with a teenager, rather than a 17-year-old boy with a 15-year-old girlfriend. And it's one of those things.
The label's the same though, isn't it?
The label is the same, but the circumstances are different. And I think,
different.
especially with the 17 and the 15-year-old, I think public opinion are more tolerant of that. However, legally, yes, they are. I would say so. Yeah.
Do you think so?
I think it's a complex one. I mean, I certainly remember historically you would have a group of young men who would come to the attention of the authorities for unlawful sexual intercourse with a consenting partner, where what would happen in essence is that the parents would report it to the authorities, because obviously the intricacies around the age of consent. Now, I worked in a youth offending team, and disproportionately what you would also see is quite often what happened, and the backdrop to it was that the boyfriend was the bad boyfriend. He was already in trouble with the authorities and the law. The parents were the very middle class parents who
so
were
it was more
concerned
about class, wasn't it?
And there was a class dimension to it. There was sometimes a sort of rightful concern, and there were sort of social jokes. I'm sure it has always gone on. Do you remember that Matt Lucas and David Walliams used to do the sort of joke in their awful Little Britain about the teacher that married the student? I'm sure those things have the former student. Those things have always gone on. There's always been an element of concern about where the boundaries around consent and acceptability are. But I think it's fair to say that perhaps what we see the other side with the rise of social media is, this is one of the things that interests me. One of those that have been pulled in, particularly through the entrapment, are not those typical sort of Rain Mac wearing men of myth. They're very often professional, successful people who've lived quite often very long lives without any history of being convicted for sexual offences. I've seen accounts of it being policemen, teachers, social workers, former prison officers. We are talking about people who very often have large family networks, who are very sort of respected within the community. And I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that historically those groups similarly weren't involved in child sexual abuse, but certainly what's happening through these sort of forms of entrapment is those people are perhaps being pulled into the justice system.
The ones that are sort of like got their toes just before that line are getting dragged over the line.
Is this and that's the sort of starting point, is it, Charlie? That is seemingly what's happening.
I think so, because obviously again they are being targeted before they've actually committed an offence. But I think that's one of the main justifications for paedophile hunters, is that they get the job done before the crime has actually been committed. But it's one of those things. It's like one of the main criticisms of the police service is that they are reactive rather than proactive. But at the end of the day, it's one of the main foundations of our justice system is that you are innocent until you're proven guilty,
or until you've committed the actual offence. And indeed, in both the US and the United Kingdom, we don't have a specific law that is entrapment as such. But you shouldn't break the law irrespective. But you can almost create the situation in which someone is pushed more into a more likely law-breaking act. I mean, for example, if you went and spat into someone's face, they may not be justified in punching you back, but the likelihood is that they will do. If we think about John Prescott being hit on the back of the head with an egg, being assaulted doesn't necessarily therefore make it right that you can turn around and assault the individual that's done it, but people have a sort of sympathy that there can be a sort of push towards law breaking, but you're suggesting that for the paedophile hunters, this in part, particularly because of the sort of moral attitudes and the viewpoints in the public at large towards sexual offences against children, this is part of the sort of badge of honour that they wear. They say, I think so, we're preventative, we're stopping these people.
They see themselves as an enforcer of the law before the crime has been committed, which in their eyes is good, because it means, well, we've committed a would-be criminal who would have committed this offence, but there's no victim because we got them before they could do it.
Yeah, and of course the problem with that is, how do you prove that?
Yeah, well, it's like the old stop and search law. It's racial profiling, that kind of thing. It's what the thought police. You can't arrest somebody for thinking about something that they may or may not do. There has to be physical evidence of them breaching the law, and in some cases there hasn't been.
I assume that for a lot of the paedophile hunters, though, they would say that the sort of offence is committed the minute that the individual actually takes that sort of physical step of going to meet. Yeah. And
there is an argument that they've attempted to do it, and that's enough.
Sometimes as well they sound like images.
This is an interesting thing, and we'll get back to who the paedophile hunters are in a second, but this is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because you say, this inducement and entrapment that they can become involved in can also involve sending images that they possess to the person, which are themselves of children. The perpetrator that they're after will say, to prove that you're real, send me an indecent photo, and they will send that indecent photo to them. Of course, the interesting thing about that is there is only one group in society that are allowed to possess that sort of material, and that is the authorities, and they are not the authorities.
No.
So in claiming that these people are acting in a criminal way, if they're doing that sort of thing, they are also themselves breaking the law. There is no acceptable defence to having child sexual abuse material under law for any normal person, and yet they have it, they possess it, they'll send it to people, and then they'll say, but we've done the public a service.
It's not just that, if you take the service part of it, and this is great, if remove this person or whatever, it's the fact that if the police were to do this investigation, they then wouldn't put on social media, this guy lives here, this is his wife, this is his children, because at the end of the day, just because this person might rightly so deserve a life sentence for what they've done, does that mean his wife deserves it? Does this mean his children deserve it?
It's a double-edged sword, because it's a justification and a criticism. The justification is like, paedophile hunters are not regulated by statutes or Act of Parliament, so they can do whatever they want. They don't have to. They're not bound by the rules of the law like the police are. And so a justification is that they are far more effective. And yet the criticism is also, well, you're doing things that you shouldn't be doing, because if the main point of the justice system is to deliver justice fairly and transparently, and if you're exceeding legal boundaries by doing that, then you're not delivering justice. But that brings me, when you were saying about posting details of the offender online, I happened to come across a live stream a couple of months ago of a paedophile hunter group, and they were down in Birmingham, and they were outing this man. And he was, I think, your typical offender in sort of mid-40s, quite that kind of character, and they outed him as a paedophile, and he sort of closed the doors on him, locked himself inside the house, and he had like he had someone in the house, a woman, it was, whether it was his mother or his wife, or it wasn't clear, but they put on the video saying, this is where the guy lives, here's his address. And apparently what happened was a few people went down there to berate him, to attack him, or what have you. And what they actually did was they went to the wrong house, and they berated
this does happen.
And they verbally abused the wrong person.
It does happen a lot, unfortunately.
And this, you were describing, because you've watched the videos of these, and the way in which paedophile hunters confront the offender is very different to the police, who would confront them by, you are Mr. Jones, I am arresting you, you have the right to remain silent, anything you say will be... I can't
maybe
remember
using a court of law.
I can't remember the contemporary caution. I used to know both of them, but you don't have the right to remain silent anymore. You can draw inferences from it. I'm not a lawyer, but I can remember little bits and pieces. But essentially, with the police, you would get a police caution. You would then be taken to the police station. You would then have access to legal advice. You'd certainly have professionals dealing with you who would not be going, "You mate are a nonce," and that's the sort of the confrontational style is very often. It's a group, isn't it, confronting the individual. And they'll play the sort of quasi-role of bad cop or good cop. So one will be going, well, we just want to help you, mate, and just admit it. There's help for people like you out there. And another will be sticking a mobile phone going, do you like this, you dirty perv, in their face. And they're very hostile, aren't they?
There are some hunter groups that I think do conduct themselves in a more proper manner, more in line with the police, because I was watching another documentary. I think there is a paedophile hunter group in the East Midlands, I believe. I think they're working with Nottinghamshire Police, and they're actually working on drafting a code of conduct, which if that came into force, would obviously mean that this is something that the paedophile hunters would have to abide by and have to regulate themselves according to. And if that sort of thing came into force, I think that would greatly increase the sort of not just the effectiveness, but also the relationship between paedophile hunters and the police and the public as well, because it meant they would be a legally enforceable sort of contract for themselves to abide to.
And of course, the other side of it is, I suppose, in defence of the hunter groups, the more professional ones might rightly point out that there is a history of voluntarism, be it neighbourhood watch or police special constables, or there are all sorts of roles that are taken by people.
Hot fuzz is totally coming to my mind now. The greater good. The greater good.
I talk about it as well. So one of the things is, there is a difference between citizen-led or citizen-involved policing, neighbourhood watch and, community, all that kind of stuff. But there's a difference between that and non-state agents sort of encroaching themselves within the justice system to the point that it's completely undermined.
Yes, yeah. So and it's about where that necessarily sits, which leads us to the question that I have then. What about the sort of people getting involved in this, and where does the motivation come from? I assume people don't just sort of wake up one day and go, you know what, I always fancied being a graphic designer, but today, Matthew, I'm going to be a paedophile hunter. Or is it simply like that anyone can get involved?
I would wager that most people who get involved with paedophile hunting is that they have some sort of personal interest, or in that maybe they know someone who was abused as a child, or maybe one of their own children was abused, or maybe they know someone who was convicted of an offence. A documentary I was watching of a paedophile hunter, she said, she goes, I got involved in this because my friend's daughter was abused as a child, and it turned out to be the woman's husband who was doing it. And it was like, well, I could see, yes, morally your reason is just and it is good, but does that give you the legal right to get involved within the justice system? And
of course, the other side is that there's a message encoded into this as well, which is shown in the sort of that you were just giving it, which is that you have a situation where one of the hunters is saying, my personal situation was that I've been very close to abuse, so we're going to go out and find the abusers. But in the terms of that going to find the abusers, that's quite different to the reality of a lot of sexual offending, isn't it? That sexual offending tends to take place within the family or friend or kinship group, that it's very immediate to the individual. Certainly, and like I said, that's quite different to sort of possession of child sexual abuse material, or because which may or may not be a gateway towards physical contact offending. People, even academic experts, disagree on that. But that actual sort of physical contact offending tends to not be the predatory stranger, but the way that the paedophile hunter networks present the danger is that this is a stranger danger that affects all our children.
They sort of work backwards from a conclusion. They say, well, I first got involved. They say I first got involved in paedophile hunting because this person who I thought was a friend turned out to be a paedophile, and they work backwards on that conclusion. Or there's an element of bias where they say, well, surely all paedophiles must be of a similar sort of character or similar sort of characteristics, and they sort of work backwards from that conclusion, and it sort of brings this element of bias into their investigation.
And I mean, I made the point earlier on, and I think it's a good point to talk just very briefly about it. That in some ways this occurs in a wider world of sort of the internet and social media and the new sort of networked world being used for investigation, and a blurring of the boundaries between sort of authority figures and the agencies of the state. And I think about, for example, in some ways, removed from the sort of paedophile hunters stuff, you've got the sort of you've got new people pushing themselves forward as sort of skilled and seasoned investigators, sometimes blurring the sort of police and media world. I think about, for example, Mark Williams Thomas in The Investigator, for example, sponsored by Simon Cowell, which sort of ran for 2 series. I mean, Mark makes sort of claims to have been a former police investigator, although he's never all that clear on managing an investigation is quite a senior rank in the police force. And as the investigator, he doesn't seem to have actually investigated stuff to a conclusion. It's more like the throwing out of stuff for entertainment purposes. And then that happens with things like web sleuthing, where people find the unsolved cases, the disappearance of Maura Murray, or any crime that's been unsolved, and all of a sudden they'll start to read into, well, it was the priest that did it, but
in the library with the...
But of course they've got no investigatory experience. The difference between the authorities is they're trained in a way. But then I suppose the other side is I've just given this quite a negative portrayal in some ways. But over Christmas, one of the topics that sort of gripped me towards the end of 2019, a little while back from now, is the documentary, the Netflix documentary Don't F With Cats. And I don't know if you've seen it, but the case it essentially involves a Canadian murderer. But the first instance of his pathway towards the horrific crime that he committed was to essentially YouTube video himself murdering kittens. And this created a sort of reaction where a group of people on the internet essentially became a sort of investigatory body to track him down. And in actual fact, at every stage of their investigation, it would seem that they were actually pretty effective as investigators. They were far beyond where the police were in terms of investigating. The interesting aspect of that is ultimately there is an argument of were they so effective that it sort of exacerbated
I think they did a similar thing. Was it on American Vandal with the graffiti? I think it was very similar.
Yeah, and that, so there can be an effectiveness, I suppose, but the question I guess you're raising in a way, Charlie, is not over efficacy, and it's certainly not a protection of sexual offenders. It's the question of who are the right people to be doing it. And again, I guess we can judge some of that on the background of the people who become involved, which takes us onto the case of Cameron Batterson in Stoke, who sort of started out as a paedophile hunter, but more happened, didn't it? Can you tell us a little bit about that case?
So yeah, what he did, he claimed to be a self-styled paedophile hunter, and obviously in the course of tracking down these predators, he downloaded several images of child pornography and indecent images with children, and he arguably became desensitized to these graphic images, and eventually it actually became sort of enamoured with him. He sort of started having his own similar fantasies as a paedophile would have, and he claimed that he started off as a paedophile hunter, but eventually became so infused about these images that he eventually became one himself.
So the sort of tools of the trade, in a way, opened the gateway for him to
I think become, a little bit, yeah.
And he, in his case, he actually committed contact sexual offences as well, didn't he?
I believe he, yeah. Like I said, he was only 21 years old when he was convicted last year. I would say, yeah, I think there was probably a history of him. There was maybe when he was 16 or 17, probably had a slightly younger girlfriend below the age of consent, and that's, I think, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, that's how these things tend to start these days, is that you have a slightly younger girlfriend who is technically underage, but the label is still the same.
Yes, yeah. And again, it's an interesting one, because even with the sort of terminology of paedophile hunter, the backgrounds of some of those who are involved is very different to that. Indeed, some of those who are involved would never be charged with being able to act in the way that police officers would, because they would never get into the police. And no. One that jumps to mind straight away for me is a documentary was made about him, and he became badged in that, the paedophile hunter, who's Stinson Hunter. Charlie, can you tell us a little bit about Stinson Hunter, or the paedophile hunter?
Yeah, so he is probably the archetype of paedophile. He's probably the origins of where that label came from. But Stinson Hunter, so a little bit, sort of a background into his life. He was, I think he was sexually abused as a child himself, which obviously is where that sort of interest in paedophile hunting came from. But he was sort of as a child and as a teenager, he was quite unruly. He served a custodial sentence at HMP Grandin for arson, and he's said in several interviews that he's through his adult life he's had issues with alcohol and with drugs. I say this as a boast. He does sound quite humble, to be fair, but he boasted once in an interview that he said he's homeless and in debt, but he still gets more convictions than the police.
Yeah, and he makes those sort of claims to efficacy, and in some ways he also uses that as part of the sort of story of his rehabilitation, in that he says, well, essentially I was once the bad guy, but now I'm the good guy, and the public definitely get on board with that, don't they? I mean, he's appeared in Closer magazine and goes on television programmes and talk shows like This Morning and so on, but again, that perhaps raises questions about to what extent is that the motivation, because the other side is they can use use that, can't they, Kyla, for sort of financial purposes and to monetize it, but also these sort of claims that all of this is being done for the greater good is
it's like the quote he said where he said it didn't sit naturally with him and he was just a normal idiot and he didn't want the fame. But I'm sorry, if you don't want the fame, then don't tweet about it, don't stick it on social media,
don't have a documentary called Paedophile Hunter featuring you on Channel 4.
Just do your job, give it to the police and let the police deal with it after that. Don't become judge and jury. But I think this is where you get into a wider discussion. Because at the end of the day, it's almost like policing, we're all policing ourselves. And social media is becoming the place to go. You know, if I have my bike stolen, I'm going to go to my local areas group where logic and reason go to die. I'm going to put a picture up of the bike and say, some scum has nicked my bike. You always have to have the scum because that elicits the response. It's the go-to. I mean, just this morning, I've been looking at it and we've got lost parrots in trees, stolen bikes, we have missing friends, we have broken car mirrors, parking issues, kids hanging around shops.
And these come with sort of, so you go onto your local Facebook group and there are all sorts of reports of suspicions, aren't they? Yeah. Janice warning people to beware in the local area.
Oh yes, because we have one this morning saying to beware because there was a man in a white van that wanted to share Jaffa cakes with children. So that's topical.
So immediately that must lead to the conclusion that he must be a child sex offender.
There's a difference.
Well, he has got a white van.
Between being vigilant and being paranoid.
Yes,
slightly.
Exactly. And also, I mean, a lot of people these days as well have CCTV set up around their homes, and they will share these pictures of, do you know this man?
Yeah.
Please tell me. It's like, why? It's almost like the police are being taken out the equation at some point.
Just this morning.
But there's a really concerning element to that, isn't there? In that if you want to destroy someone's reputation or have them targeted for violence, you put out a spurious story about how they're a child sex offender or a paedophile.
It's happened, hasn't it?
And it has happened.
It has happened.
And the public don't necessarily question this.
No, straight away.
It's almost the immediate reaction is, that must be the case. I've seen it on social media.
So it must be true.
It must be true.
Let's go round, stick a brick through his window.
Nothing makes a better scapegoat than a sex offender.
Exactly. If you've got an issue with someone, just put it there on your little.
One thing guaranteed to unite the entire general public is
sex offender. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and again, I think we're in no way, shape, or form defending those who commit sexual offences against children. I've been in plenty of prisons with some around some people who have done the most abhorrent things. One of the things I continually sort of try and say to people though is, let's get the message right. The degree of paranoia towards strangers needs to be refocused. People need to rethink that, it's not dangerous predatory strangers that come out of nowhere that get close to children. It often involves a process of grooming. It's by people who are known to them, where they've built up trust. It's about having that relationship with trust with your own children who can come and talk to you, and the whole narrative of these sort of dangerous predators out there.
It's like my daughter's 14. I Saturday before I went to work, I'm sat there in my bedroom and she comes up and she thrusts her mobile phone in my face and she says, "Oh my God, have you seen that one?" I don't have to go into telling you what she was showing me, but this was not attached to a child. This was attached to a grown man. So I take the phone off her. I send messages to this person saying, "This is a 14-year-old girl. If you do it again, I will chop it off." Obviously, I go full on, I then report it and I turn around to Ava and say, "Every single time this happens, you need to report this. You need to report it." And she's like, "Well, I'm not daft enough to meet these people." And I have to say to her, "Well, you might not be, but the next one might."
But someone is.
So to get that out there, I am in no way defending these people at all. But we still need to have a sensible conversation without the hyperbole involved.
Absolutely, and similarly, and I think that's that for me is the real thing. Even if paedophile hunters are doing a public service, it's about that contract that exists between them and the state agencies. It's about what behaviour is acceptable, and do we really need good works to be live streamed, or is that it's a bit like that thing, and you encounter it nowadays when you make a charitable donation and then you can tweet about it as a sort of signal of your virtue. Now, or
take a picture of yourself giving a coffee to a homeless person.
You want to be validated.
It's all about validation,
and you can do good without that sort of self-validation that comes comes with it. And I mean, just as a real issue, because one of the things we haven't talked about is but this is really quite prevalent, and it is an important debate, isn't it, Charlie? Because it really is growing. So can you tell us a little bit about the sort of statistics that show?
So I want to say, first and foremost, despite the statistics I'm about to go through, the official police stance is still that they refuse to work with paedophile hunter groups. However, there are regional and local police forces that are more open and more willingly will willingly work with paedophile hunter groups. Nottinghamshire Police in particular, I think, were the first to openly reject the official police stance on paedophile hunters. But so in the space of the last sort of 3 or 4 years, the number of cases involving paedophile hunter evidence has sort of exploded. So in 2018, there were 403 people prosecuted for attempting to meet a child for sexual purposes, and 252 of those cases involved evidence gathered by paedophile hunter groups. So
it's almost three quarters of the cases.
The vast majority of
this isn't public policing. This is policing by
the public.
Yeah.
And again, so I read a BBC report is that from between 2016 and 2018, the number of cases involving paedophile hunter evidence has tripled. In 2016, it was 57 cases. In 2018, it's 179. So that's gone from maybe just around a quarter of cases to more than 60% of cases.
And that's 2 years ago, and it's grown exponentially in each year since then as well, hasn't it? So we're getting to a stage where I think it's claimed that over 60% of cases now brought before the courts is not evidence gathered by the authorities, but evidence gathered by paedophile hunter groups. So I think it's absolutely right that we do have that conversation about how they act.
At this point, it's a growing trend, and it's one you cannot deny or ignore. And it's one, like you said, we have to have a discussion about it. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. There are hunter groups out there working with the police to draft a code of conduct, which, if it becomes enforced, which would mean that paedophile hunter groups have a set of standards they have to adhere to, and it would mean they have to conduct themselves properly.
Yeah.
And it would increase the efficacy and the effectiveness of their entire existence, really.
Absolutely. And I think there's an important element in that, which...
I'm going to do something really out of character for me, and I am just about to do something that you would never thought I was going to do. I'm just about to sort of stick up for the police here.
Hold on. Hold the press. Our resident Marxist is about to say something on behalf of the police. Drum roll.
Well, what I'm going to say is that these people are filling a need that the police aren't doing. And why aren't the police doing it? Not because they don't care, because they haven't got the resources. They haven't got the resources to look at the cases where people have committed the crime, let alone the preemptive stuff. So at the end of the day, I think what we need to look, what needs to happen, another conversation that needs to happen, is that we need money putting into the police to not just work with these people, but to incorporate this within their parameters, because only then will it happen. No, will it work properly, where these people will have a legitimate code of conduct, and because they will be officers themselves.
Yeah, that is a really interesting point, isn't it? And I think that takes us beyond where we are at times.
I feel a bit
at the
ill
moment.
now.
We often have these debates at the moment. Our contemporary debate is we need 20,000 extra police officers walking the beat. But if where crime is being reported,
crime's not on,
is
not just on the street
on social media. Do we need an extra 20,000 police officers walking the beat, or is it about a change in the role and the function and the realities of policing today?
Society is changing, so we need the police to adapt. They need to adapt.
Well, definitely. I think that's a great topic, and maybe that's one we should come back to on a future podcast. But
maybe with a police person.
Yeah, with a police person. We have got some people.
I will behave myself. I promise you.
I'm glad you brought up, as you said, austerity cuts mean that there are far too many vulnerable people in society and far too few police officers to be able to address all their needs. But bringing up the police though, one of the main things I saw when I was doing some research, I saw a great quote. Do you know Robert Peel? He's the founder.
Yes.
He's credited with the foundation of the Metropolitan Police Service, and he's the founding father. But there was a quote from him. He said that he has all his principles of what the police should be, doesn't he? One of his principles is
battering the working class. Carry on.
He says that the police are the public and the public are the police. So right from the get-go, way back in, when was this? The late...
the 1800s.
Early 17th, early 19th century. There we go. But he right from the get-go, he said, when he established Metropolitan Police Services, that the police and the public need to work together. It's the only way they can succeed is with the willing participation of the public.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great topic. I think that sort of it highlights the sort of changing society, the changing role of policing, the issues of legitimacy, the limits of the law and the criminal law. There's so much we could have sort of talked all day about this one, but Charlie, thank you ever so much for joining us today, and it's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks again to is she a Marxist anymore? She's just been sticking up for the police, although they batter the working classes.
Yes.
Thanks
redeemed
to
myself at the last minute. So.
Thanks to my co-presenter and resident Marxist Kyla, and it's a thank you from me. If you've enjoyed this podcast and you're interested in studying all sorts of areas related to crime and criminal justice, Charlie teaches law here, and you'll certainly encounter the criminal law and criminal justice if you come and study at Staffordshire University. You can find out more about doing that at our website, which is www.staffs.ac.uk. All that's left from me then is to say thank you once again for joining us, and do keep listening to Crime Tapes. Thanks very much. A final thing, in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to be looking at Truman Capote's book, In Cold Blood, his account of a murder in Midwestern America. It might well be worth you picking up and reading a copy if you really want to follow what we're talking about. So that's a warning that Truman Capote's In Cold Blood is coming up as a podcast, and you might want to read the book.
However, as always, we will explain what's going on, so you can actually watch it without reading the book. And you can also go and find Wikipedia. We never tell students to do that. That's really bad, by the way. But however, it does help.
But it's like lectures. If you do the reading, it's better. It's better.
Oh, sure.
Crime Tapes couldn't happen without the remarkable students and staff in the Staffordshire University School of Law, Policing and Forensics. Do you see yourself as a crime investigator, researcher, or even preventing crime and protecting the community on the front line in the police force? Whatever your future holds, a great education is the first step into making it a reality. Browse our courses at staffs.ac.uk and discover your potential.